I want to introduce myself quickly. My name is Mark Bowers. I'm a training advisor here at World Relief, directing our efforts to equip churches with learning resources and opportunities around immigration issues. And I'm so glad to convene this conversation with you today. Let me introduce you to our panelists. Today, we've got a great lineup of folks who are going to chat through this topic with us, starting with Liliana Reza. She lives in the San Diego-Tijuana border region herself, and she is the director of border engagement here at World Relief, where she oversees our border immersion work and partnerships there in the region. She's an ordained elder in her church and has been deeply formed by the immigrant church and her mixed status family, and has over a decade of experience serving across borders. Liliana, we are so glad you're with us. Say hello, so we know who you are. Welcome. We also have Matthew Sorens with us today. He is the Vice President of Advocacy and Policy at World Relief, and also the National Coordinator of the Evangelical Immigration Table. He's been with us for nearly 2 decades, so a wealth of experience and knowledge. He is also the co-author of several books, including Welcoming the Stranger, Justice, Compassion, and Truth in the Immigration Debate. I encourage you to check it out. We also have a leader guide, an online course around welcoming the stranger that you can take for free. I would love to tell you more about that. Matthew, welcome. Thank you for your good work with us as well. We also have a special guest, Paco Amador, who is a pastor at New Life Community Church in Little Village, which is a neighborhood of Chicago where he lives and shepherds his congregation. And as a multicultural church there, New Life affirms the unity of the church through the diversity of languages and ethnic groups of 27 different congregations across that region. I love that. And each of the New Life congregations immerses itself in the flow of the life of the neighborhood in which it's rooted. I had the privilege of hearing Paco speak at the CCDA conference last year, and it is such a delight to have you join us here today, brother. Welcome and thank you. I also want to welcome Sammy Di Pasquale, who has vast experience in refugee and immigrant community work, having lived in Jordan and Cyprus and Egypt, India, and is now at the U.S. Mexico border there, where he is the executive director serving at Abara Borderland Connections in El Paso. Abara seeks to foster meaningful learning and action around border issues there in the El Paso region in pursuit of holistic change. So Sammy, thank you so much for being here as well with us. Can we give our panelists a virtual round of applause? It takes a lot of courage to jump in and speak to a couple hundred of you on Zoom. You don't even know who's here, right? And so we are so delighted you all have jumped in with us today. And so I want to dive right in with these panelists. Let's talk context around the border, what we're seeing in the landscape right now down at the southern border. We were there last month, myself with Liliana and Matt, and we heard over and over from migrants, from Border Patrol, from pastors, that we have an overwhelmed system, like many of you mentioned in the chat. In fact, you're right. In 2023, 1.4 million people were apprehended at the U.S. Mexico border. That's the highest number on record. And one unique thing that I learned on that trip was that in past years, the majority of people attempting to enter the U.S. without authorization were seeking to do that undetected. But now in recent years, a very large share of them who arrive at the border are not trying to evade detection by Border Patrol. They're actually looking for Border Patrol in order to seek asylum in the United States. But right now, the U.S. does not have the capacity to process all of these asylum requests. So it means that people are detained temporarily, background checked, and then allowed into the U.S. with a notice to appear in immigration court, where they can present their asylum case. Often they're left in legal limbo, awaiting that final court date. So that's just a glimpse of something I learned there that shows that the border is not open, and it's also not really ever fully closed. And yet the system is certainly broken. So I just want to ask each one of you, starting, what is the actual crisis at the border? Some of you might say there's a crisis, but perhaps not a security crisis the way it's often painted, So please share more with us about what you've seen and experienced. Is there a crisis at the border? If so, what is it? How would you describe it? Liliana, let's start with you.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. That's actually a really great question. I actually think it's important for us to remember just that the movement of people across neighborhoods, across cities, across borders is something that has been happening since the beginning of time. People move. People move for a lot of reasons. So I think it's important for us to reframe and understand what migration is and the purpose of migration. And also just to say that migration is not something new. And also that God is not overwhelmed by migration, because when we read scripture, we see migration and people moving, and God even calling people to move to different places throughout scripture, from Genesis to Revelation. So I think that's just an important thing for us to begin there so that we have that sort of framework to work out of. Now, when we think about some evident things that are happening here at our southern border, there are two things that I want to just kind of point out that really impact not only what's happening at our southern border, but also at large, which is global displacement and push and pull factors. Which we not only see now, but again, when we go back to scripture, and when we even look back in our history, we see famine, we see civil unrest, we see all of these other kind of, again, push and pull factors that that move people from a secure location to another secure location. But in regards to defining what a crisis is, it is a time of difficulty, and we do see that right now here at the southern border. And I think I would say we have a humanitarian crisis here at our southern border, in which we are trying to figure out how to respond to the human displacement and this global displacement that we're talking about. And I think another thing for us to consider that's happening here at our southern border and what we're experiencing, especially here in San Diego, Tijuana, in this part of the southern border, is these open air holdings or open air detention sites, which that itself is a crisis. It's unprecedented, and we've never seen anything like that. And that's because there's been this influx of large populations coming. So I think that those are two things for us to consider. And just to remember that they're not just situations or issues, that these are vulnerable people. These are God's people. These are people made in the image of God. And I think that that's an important framework for us to kind of work out of. So I'm going to pass the baton over to Matt and see.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Liliana. I would definitely agree with that assessment and really value your perspective being there at the border. And I'm not at the border. I'm outside of Chicago. I get the chance to visit occasionally. I think from my perspective, what we're talking about is actually a series of cascading crises. It's not one crisis at the border. There's almost always a crisis that is why someone chooses to leave their country of origin. Whether that's in Haiti or in Central America or in Mexico or Venezuela or in Africa or the Middle East. No one chooses to leave home out of sort of casual, let's just take a very, very dangerous journey. There's always a crisis, and sometimes that's a crisis of violence and persecution that might qualify someone under U.S. law for asylum. And sometimes it's economic hardship or extreme poverty or environmental degradation that might not qualify them for asylum. But it's a crisis in either case. And I think there's an important role for the church. And this is what I love about World Relief is we're alongside churches in Haiti and in other parts of the world, addressing those root causes that compel people to feel that there's no choice but to leave home. And then people do get to the border, and I think there's, as Liliana said, I think it's fair to describe what's happening as a humanitarian crisis. And that's really at the root of that is a disconnect between the number of people who are showing up and wanting to seek asylum and the number of the capacity that the U.S. government has in terms of asylum adjudication to actually verify who qualifies and who doesn't. And then as a result of that, you have, as you said, Mark, pretty large numbers of people being given court dates in communities all around the United States. So this crisis doesn't start in Tijuana or Juarez or other points of the border. It doesn't end there for most people either, because some people are turned away and are never allowed to enter, but others are allowed to come into the United States with a court date, sometimes several years into the future. And they're lawfully present while they're waiting for their court date. but they're not lawfully allowed to work in many cases, which has created a whole nother crisis in a community like Chicago or Denver or Los Angeles or various other communities, where for obvious reasons, when you have people who are allowed to be here but are not allowed to work and provide for themselves. But the last thing I would say is sometimes I think there's this narrative of crisis that is sometimes paired with an idea of, well, this is an invasion. And to be really clear, I think that's really troubling rhetoric that is not my experience when I visited different points of the border. You know, the communities like El Paso and San Diego and McAllen are actually very safe communities. We all know what an invasion is. An invasion is what the Russian government has done to Ukraine. It's when you go in with weapons and try to take over a country. In fact, even groups that are actually really opposed to more immigration in the United States, restrictionist immigration groups in Washington, D.C., have said that that's not fair to categorize this as an invasion. This is not people coming with weapons. It is people coming with their hands out, asking for help. And it's an important policy discussion whether, and which ones of those individuals should qualify for that assistance. And we could have that discussion. But I don't want us to slander the people who are coming seeking to avail themselves of what actually U.S. law offers to those with a well-founded fear of persecution. And be really careful that, first and foremost, these are neighbors whom our faith in Jesus calls us to love.
I love that, Matt. Thank you so much. Rich insights. Pastor Paco, what would you add?
Thank you so much, man. Yeah, those are very good insights. The biblical, of course, we can find, like Liliana said, this is an age-old situation. It has happened throughout history. In the book of Ruth, it's interesting what will end up happening. The end of the book of Ruth is leading up to the story of King David, but the book of Ruth begins with a traveling outside of the promised land, which, when you think about it, is a city named the city of abundant bread, and it's running out of bread. There's a famine, so people have to go to in the opposite way in which they would want to go. And so, and they end up going to the land of Moab, which is really the wrong way from the promised land to the land of Moab. And it's deeply, it's so well expressed, just the troubling of the husband dying, the children just being, it's like life breaking down. So no one that comes here is coming for comfort. No one that comes here is coming because they want to go and, Disney World or something like that. They're coming at great peril. I feel like that's important to always remember that we would do the same thing. If America came into a deep famine, we would all be traveling back to, go to Brazil, and if we have to travel countries and walk, and we would do that, for the sake of our family, for the sake of, it's just that there is a blessing at this moment. I think the border, the situation at the border also points, adding to what has already been said by Matt and Liliana, to a sort of a troubling situation that we have within our country to make a decision in how to welcome people. And this is it points to the division that there is among Christians. I feel, I'm not at the border. I'm a pastor. I speak to our church to our family of faith in America. We have I feel like it behooves us to love those who are far from us. It's sort of our mission statement from Jesus. It's like he founded a thing that is like, whose mission statement is love your neighbor. And so I think the fact that the country is divided, and in no way are our politicians making headway into creating a good, good solvable situation for immigrants that we desperately need. We, 2 generations ago, most teenagers would work during the summer in the fields, and now, we're like, I'll finish with this. During Thanksgiving, there's usually this little meme that comes up of people gathering around the table and saying, thank you to Jesus. And then there's this little meme that comes on the other side, and there's a guy named Jesus saying, you're welcome, picking up, food and vegetables in the field, which I think it's a little bit of, of a mention of who's working the jobs that nobody wants in America. And it behooves us as a country, but I speak especially to to our family of faith, and we do have something important. That's why I like these kind of conversations.
Love that insight. Thank you, Pastor. Sammy, what would you add?
Well, amazing insights. It's great to be here. Thank you, Mark, Liliana, Matt, Paco. Yeah, trying to think about what to add to those amazing responses. I think, especially when the word crisis at the border is mentioned, to me, it's a little bit ironic because the border is rarely the actual crisis. It's a reflection of maybe a different crisis elsewhere or different places. A crisis globally, as was mentioned, crisis maybe of what's happening inside the U.S., whether it's broken systems or other issues, but we see a reflection of that on the border. So that's one thing that I would say. And what's already been mentioned, the crisis all over the world from different places of people being forced to flee where they are. And then the journeys that they're on. And that side sort of coming, forces coming to the border. But then maybe even more importantly from our end, being inside the United States, is maybe a crisis of narrative of what's happening inside, and a narrative that even the church is very much a part of, often supporting. Maybe even a crisis of bearing false witness against our neighbors. We're really quick to take on hear accusations, maybe in the news or through politicians, and just start repeating them without actually verifying the truth. And when I think about that, just like as, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbors, we're bearing false witness against a whole lot of neighbors in the way that we talk about the border, in the way that we talk about migration. And that's something that is really disturbing to me. I also think there is a crisis of a broken system internally that, as has been mentioned, we just don't have a system that makes sense almost on any level domestically. And we'll probably share more about that a little bit later. I also think in our context here in Texas, El Paso is right on the edge of Texas, but still a few miles inside of the borders of Texas. And what we're seeing is also a crisis of sort of state versus national interest. And also a lot of it it seems to be posturing, because we might have a crazy militarized area in a very concentrated space, and a few miles down, there's not even a fence. And it's almost like if it's truly, if there's a real danger, then it shouldn't just be concentrated, it seems like, in one place to have this militarization. And not trying to support that, but it's almost like we have some photo op opportunities that exist. And I think that is also part of the issue, is that we're prone to sound bites more and more, and especially with social media. So things that can, a one sentence solution, a one sentence problem is what we're drawn to. And so I think we struggle to try to understand when we're layering the complexity of what's actually happening. Thank you, Mark.
No, thank you. That's so good. I'd never thought about it from that angle quite like that, Sammy. That's so insightful. Thank you. And for everyone who's just joining us, that's Sammy DePasquale, Executive Director of Abara Borderlands Connections in El Paso. We also have on the panel Paco Amador, pastor at New Life Community Church in Little Village, Chicago, Matthew Sorens, our Vice President of Advocacy and Policy at World Relief, and Liliana Reza, who is our Director of Border Engagement here at World Relief as well, sharing their insights on what Christians can do about the border crisis. Now, I love this. This is so insightful, because what I hear you all saying is there is not a crisis at the border, a security crisis like an invasion, like some might lead you to believe. However, we do have a deeply broken system that is overwhelmed, that's created a different kind of crisis that's perhaps larger and more systemic and more harmful, a crisis of bearing false witness, as well as you mentioned, Sammy, about who we are, about what is true, that mars the image of God in others and in us, and that in some ways is an even greater crisis. So a crisis, yes, but perhaps not in the way that it's always sold to us. I love this about the people of the kingdom of God. As we discern nuance we're willing to hold complexity, find the truth. And now, before I get off on a sermon about that, I want to ask you another question to take us a little deeper. So we can't have a full-on history lesson about the border, but I'm wondering, for all of you in your work, what is an essential fact or historical contextual point about the border that you think we should understand, that you would share with those of us who don't live there or who don't think about the border on a daily basis? What is one thing you think we need to know? Liliana, why don't you start?
Yeah, I think for me, as someone who lives here in San Diego, and it's just that, you know, Tijuana, San Diego, this is a binational city. I think that, you know, this is, a lot of people here describe themselves as borderlanders, as fronterizos. That means that many people their lives are stretched between two sides. And that means that they might go to church on one side and commute to the other side. In the many ways that you all commute to school for an hour, or maybe to work for an hour, or to church for 30 minutes. You know, people here have their lives, you know, stretched between these two places. And so it's going back to that conversation of nuance, right? And so everyday life is happening on both sides of the border. And also, I think it's important to remember that because there's all this movement of people back and forth, it makes actually Tijuana, San Diego, and San Isidro port of entry actually the largest and busiest land border crossing in the Western Hemisphere, which is, you know, kind of crazy to think about when you think about over, you know, 100,000 people, you know, crossing by foot, and over 70,000 plus vehicles crossing, because they're wanting to live their lives in community like we do within our communities, in our cities. And so I think that that's an important historical and cultural kind of context thing to take into consideration when we talk about the borderlands, and especially our border region.
I'll jump in there, Liliana. I think, you know, it's one thing that to me has changed a lot in terms of historical context, and this is really between the ports of entry, right? So most of the migration happens at the lawful port of entry. It's people coming, go back and forth. But between ports of entry, we've seen really dramatic changes in the last 20 years or so. So 20 years ago, 2003, you had a population of people that were almost entirely from Mexico, mostly adults, mostly coming for economic reasons, you know, coming to find jobs in the United States. And most of them were not apprehended. And the U.S. Department of Homeland Security estimates that about 2 million people or more successfully crossed the border without being caught in 2003. And about less than a third of them were apprehended. And by the way, I live in a mostly Mexican immigrant community outside of Chicago, where a lot of those people are my neighbors. And I'm really glad that they're my neighbors. They're wonderful neighbors. There are a lot of people in the church that I'm a part of. And yet I also understand that it's a liability for the United States for our government not to know who's coming into the country. And I think that's important to acknowledge, that we have security concerns. There are people who want to do harm to the United States, and it's appropriate for us to expect our government to do everything reasonably possible to keep out anyone seeking to do harm. And the government needs to know who's coming in. But what's really fascinating is you fast forward to, you know, last fiscal year, 2023, it's no longer primarily people from Mexico. It's people from various countries, but a lot of that has been fueled by an increase in people from Venezuela fleeing from a really awful, both political and economic situation. It's a lot more children, both with their parents and then sometimes unaccompanied. And what's really interesting, I think, is most people are now wanting to seek asylum. That is to say, they're professing some sort of a fear of persecution. Now, do they all qualify for asylum? Probably not. Almost certainly not all of them do. But some of them do, and we won't know who does qualify for many years because our systems are so backlogged. But the reality is now, whereas it was less than a third of people being apprehended 20 years ago, now it's 75 to 80%. And that's the primary reason. Some of it is more border security funding, some of it's more border patrol agents. But the major part is that people are not trying to sneak in. For the most part, they're trying to be caught. They're coming with their hands out saying, please, could I seek asylum? And you know, I think that's a change that I think a lot of Americans haven't realized. And to be clear, that doesn't mean they all qualify or they all should qualify. I mean, those are important policy decisions. And it is really important that our Border Patrol can apprehend people and keep out those seeking to do harm. But I think if we have this idea of this is all people sort of running past the Border Patrol, we're missing out on the realities of what's currently happening along the U.S. Mexico border for the most part. I mean, that does happen several 100,000 people last year, so it's not insignificant, but it is about a third of the number of people who came in unlawfully, successfully 20 years ago. So is that an unprecedented level? It's an unprecedented number of apprehensions, but not an unprecedented number of people successfully entering the country without being caught.
Yeah, I'll jump into that question. What is one thing, and thanks, Matt and Liliana, this is really good. I'm taking a lot of notes, furious notes. I normally don't take notes furiously, but I would add to this one thing. What do I think about when I think about ministry in our context? We're in a very immigrant community as well. And I think of the gifts that immigrants bring to America, and without fail, I mean, I just think they're coming with gifts, which, I always think just, the fact that from the East, these people representing us went to Jesus with gifts. Here's the King of the world, and they show up with gifts. And I always think that symbolically to help me to think that immigrants come with great blessings. I know that normally people highlight the initial needs. People in our city are literally needing a house, just a place to sleep. Who can fault people for wanting just a place to sleep and and just a job, a job where they can serve. During the pandemic, we lost a lot of jobs, and now there's the force of people coming. So I think of two gifts. I think of many, but I'll just mention two. One of them is just the gift of spirituality. Sort of all America saying, we should pray more. And we know that Americans, we tend to be busy and we tend to feel guilty about praying. And the newest, most recent congregation that we have within our church here in our community, you find them praying all of the time. Every need they pray. It's like the longer you're around, the more you quit praying and you say, I think I can afford it, but if you don't have anything, you just go to Jesus. And America needs that. Man, we need that. I dare say that a lot of these immigrants are the answer to our prayers, to the church's prayers saying, we need a fire. Here's Jesus saying, I'm sending you fire from elsewhere. These are people that are crazy about me. They 24 hours praying, no problem. So we have different services in our church on Sunday, in our church building. The one that is the most recent immigrant, they go at night on Saturday night and go through the night praying. Like I've been there, and at some point I'm like, when I'm tired, I'm going to be preaching tomorrow. I better go to sleep. And these people just stay praying. That's one thing. The other side, I think of the gift of entrepreneurship. It's just people that are coming, like saying, I will risk. And America needs that. Man, we need people who say, you know what, can I try making something to fit right here? It's just the incredible creativity that an immigrant puts at work benefits everybody else. And so that does not mean that there's problem, situation, difficult things, but I think of the gifts. And I think, oh man, we are super blessed. The fact that most immigrants are young, oh man, I'm getting older. I don't like to admit it, but can't fight against the fact that there's white hairs. But there's younger people that pray more. Man, they pray more, and they're risking everything to say, can I find something new that is needed that I can provide it? So, I think of the blessings and the gifts. That's not the only thing that we need to think about, but that helps.
I love that. So in some ways you could argue a renewal or an answer to a spiritual crisis that we are facing in the U.S. is what we're receiving through the gifts of the nations. Fascinating. What would you add to that, Sammy, in terms of what you see as an essential contextual point there about the border that we should know?
Yeah, I have to be careful because I'll get pretty excited about the history here. So try to keep it really concise. But as you mentioned, I grew up in the Middle East, was used to growing up in cities that had hundreds or thousands of years of history and civilization sort of on top of each other. What I wasn't expecting was to find that here in El Paso and Ciudad Juarez. And part of what we're trying to cultivate here through Abara is this one space that sits right on the river, right on the border fence. And it was literally the river crossing that was been used for hundreds of years, for millennia. And if you imagine with us, like the Rocky Mountains from Canada through the U.S. down to Mexico with very few passes that you can sort of naturally cross through, one of those, the Rio Grande, the river, cut through the mountains right here in El Paso. So it was a natural crossing north, south, east, west. What that meant is that it just drew people to itself from all over the hundreds of years, including being a space for Native American travel routes. It was the actual site of Spanish colonization in 1598, where the Spanish claimed the southwest, what's now the southwest of the U.S., for the King of Spain and for God. Then later, a site of Apache resistance. It was under Spanish control for 200 years. Then you find Mexican independence, a few decades of Mexican independence, all of this before it being part of the U.S. Then the U.S. is spreading westward. After the U.S. Mexico War, we gain all of this space, forcing Mexico to cede half of its country. And so you have the Anglo expansion westward. Well, on the actual site that we're creating into this borderland center, you also had a history of slavery that was brought out. And then 30 years later, a history of the railway tracks, again, cutting through the mountains at that point, being built with Chinese laborers. And the very following year, our first Immigration Act, the Chinese Exclusion Act. So this is all only through the 1880s. So we're talking about like the last few years and the last 10 years of history. We have had waves. This is like a narrative of the American story that is often not heard as much. And it's all been drawn to some of these sites that draw people to itself. So when I think about the border today and what's happening today, we're drawn into 500, 600 years of history here, thinking of who's been welcomed, who hasn't, who's been in control, who hasn't, stories of belonging and exclusion, stories of people moving throughout the hundreds of years. And then we can be thinking there on this site, thinking about these journeys over hundreds of years, and literally someone is making that same journey along the Camino Real from Mexico City up to this point. Now there's a border fence. So what had been a connecting point for North America is now a site of division. And so I think there's so much to learn when we look back, and until we understand really fully a lot of the history, it's hard to know how to move forward. Thanks, Mark.
No, thank you once again. That's so good. And it just makes me think, you know, it's humbling to reckon with that, the long history of the nations and of the Americas and of our nation, and that we are given a part to steward in that by the Lord as his people. And kind of connecting back to what Liliana said at the beginning, God has always been on the move through people on the move. What is the larger story at work? Alluding to what Paco said of renewal, that God might be writing through the story at our southern border. And it is so helpful, it connected to what all of you have said, to remember the border is just one stop on the journey of a longer story for many immigrants who cross it for different types of reasons. I myself crossed it as a child. I drove across it with my father, who took me from Honduras through Guatemala, Mexico, to the United States in a truck. We drove back from our house in Honduras. It took about 2 weeks at that time. So even a missionary kid like myself has a border story. That was just one small piece of my story, and very different than, say, my neighbors. I live in a majority neighborhood here that is made up of Guatemalan migrant workers in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And, you know, every neighborhood, every city in the US has a neighborhood like this, where the majority of neighbors are immigrants, many undocumented. They work in restaurant kitchens, construction, roofing, chicken processing plants, housekeeping, and hotels. And on the whole, they're not committing social crimes from what I see and read. In fact, as some of your research has shown too, Matt, they do most everything they can to avoid the law. And while they're certainly not perfect human beings, their primary infringement of the law is that they want to work. And some fascinating studies have come out recently reflecting the implications of this. Health and Human Services found that 124 billion net positive financial impact has come into the US economy through refugees and asylees over the past 15 years when you compare it to the general US population. And also, the National Bureau of Economic Research looked at the costs of what it takes to resettle someone in the United States between 1990 up to 2014, so about 15-year period. And the average cost of resettling someone is about $15,000, background checks, housing, English lessons, job training. So it costs something to the United States. But the study showed that at about 8 years of their arrival, refugees start to pay more in taxes than they receive in benefits. And by the time the person has lived in the US for 20 years, the evidence suggests that they will have paid about $21,000 on average per person in taxes than they received in benefits from all levels of government since they arrived. So this is helpful to think about, right? Because people across the US are concerned about the economy. We've seen that in the past years through the inflation story, in labor shortages. If you visit a restaurant, the hours are cut. Getting a home repair can take weeks, right? And it seems to me like perhaps immigration reform that allowed for more workers could actually help our economy. So let's talk about that. Let's think about people like my neighbors, for example, who come to the US to work, but they can't do so with documentation. So they come without documents. They come unprotected. I'm happy to send those studies out as well, Nicole, in follow-up if you'd like to look at those numbers. Great reminder. So let's imagine someone comes without documents, unprotected. And in fact, before this call, before this meeting, I asked around in my neighborhood, what's the going rate? If you want to pay someone to smuggle you into the US from Guatemala, what's the price? It used to be about $8,000 when I moved into the neighborhood a decade ago. I got numbers anywhere from $10,000 up to $15,000 now. So is there a compelling argument that immigration reform could actually economically funnel that money away from traffickers and cartels and into our system in the US so that people could apply for legal entry to work and also come to strengthen our economy with the labor that we need? Complex question. What do you think? Liliana, you want to start on that one?
It is a complex question. And I actually feel like we cannot speak about immigration reform or even the impacts, economic impact of people moving or coming to the US, whether refugees, asylum seekers, without speaking about dreamers, without speaking about DACA recipients, and without speaking about the over 1.1 million undocumented immigrants that are already in this country. And the ways that they have sustained us, not only for the last couple of decades, but especially during our pandemic. And, you know, and we're overshadowed and we're just working hard. And I speak about DACA and I speak about dreamers because a lot of them are my friends, are my family members, are people that, you know, I grew up with in the church that had dreams just like I did of, you know, pursuing an education, becoming a professional, buying a home, being a good, faithful citizen within their communities, and continue to come up to these blocks of not being able to have a way to actually be here lawfully and have a permanent status. And so I think that while the conversation of, you know, these impacts of the refugees and asylum seekers coming through like here with economics, I think it's important for us to take a step back and also include in this conversation those that have already been here for such an extensive amount of time, and just to recognize that there's been, since I think 2007, we haven't opened the door again for people to apply for this type of like status, so that they can have at least although it's not permanent, a temporary sort of way to be able to contribute and be able to be just a good part of the community here, a sustainable and good part. So I just think that that's so important for us to consider as we're speaking about this, because immigration reform is not just, when we're speaking about it, it's not just asylum seekers and refugees. There's so many different types of people that benefit from this type of comprehensive conversation. And so I wanted to make sure that we also highlight those.
I love that. Yeah, thanks for sharing that, the complexity of that and the breadth of that as well. Matthew, what would you add? Is there a compelling economic argument for reform?
Yeah, I mean, I think you talk to almost any economist and they'll tell you that there is. The Bureau of Labor Statistics says right now that there's 8.8 million job openings in the United States. And they also say that there's 6.5 million people looking for work. So if we matched every single unemployed person with a job, we would still need about 2.3 million more workers just to fill our current economy. And our economy, fortunately, is growing with a really low unemployment rate. And, I think you started the conversation, Mark, noting that last year there was 1.4 million individuals apprehended crossing the border unlawfully. Some of them apprehended more than once, but 1.4 million individuals. So even if they had all qualified and been given work authorization or put into a job, we would still have a labor shortage. So in my mind, a lot of the challenge isn't that there's a lot of people coming. The challenge is that there's a lot of people coming who in many cases are not authorized to work. And it actually could be a solution to a problem we face in the United States, a problem that is fueling inflation and other challenges for Americans overall. If we, first of all, we figured out how to help people access work authorization more quickly, and there's policy reforms that could do that, but also had more legal immigration options for people who actually may not be fleeing persecution, but are fleeing extreme poverty and would love to go to the consulate in their country of origin and request a visa, but that visa doesn't exist for them. And our visa system has been so out of date for literally decades. It has really no correspondence to the needs of the U.S. labor market.
Thanks, Matt. Paco, what would you add? Pastor?
I would just add on two sides. We underestimate the power of the workers that are here that are helping many other countries throughout the world. It's sort of like the money that people send to help to alleviate poverty with relatives and friends back home in almost every country in the world, man. It is a powerful way in which America helps. And that is such we need to put it as a very important way of benevolence to the world. And you can't underestimate that. I wish I was much more of a data guy that could give you numbers and everything. But on the other side, I do find that most people who are immigrants in our community, at least, they came to work and they are wanting to work more. I was talking to an immigrant, Guatemalan, and he was saying, man, they only give me 40 hours a week to work, which I thought that's what every American wants. Like I could, back home, I used to work, I think 80 or something like that hours, which, it's hard workers is what everybody's looking for. And so anyways, that's one thing I would add.
And I love the point you made about remittances, right? The money that people work and send internationally as well as maybe the best form of aid, because it's aid based on work, not on charity, right? That's sent relationally, not government transfers, right? Or handouts or through nonprofits. We love nonprofits and we love donations, but in some ways, by allowing people to work, by reforming the immigration system, there's secondary effects to the global economy and global poverty. I love that. I want to follow that thread too. Sammy, what would you add?
Probably just two things on top of completely agreeing with everything that's been stated. Those who are already here, whether it's undocumented dreamers, the impact of those who might be arriving, our birth rate not actually being able to sustain even the population we have. So the only way of actually sustaining or wanting to grow is for more people to come. Remittances, all amazing. The two things I did, one, I would say the impact hyper locally for us, and Liliana touched on this in Tijuana and San Diego, and it's very similar in El Paso, Juarez, where we are one community in two countries. And so I would talk about the economic challenges of that when you have your community split down the middle in relation to a national issue or a national border, there's a lot of impact economically at a local level. And so all of the tens of thousands of people who live in Ciudad Juarez and work in the US with documentation or come to school in the US or vice versa, even in our own staff, and this is not, abnormal for businesses. Part of our staff lives in Juarez, a part of our staff lives in El Paso, and anything related to the border, whether it's especially any murmurs of closing the border, like the impact on these border communities where I can't get to work, I can't get to school, like UTEP, University of Texas, El Paso here, a good portion of the students are crossing every day from Juarez. So many people are going back and forth, just like they do in your cities. If you imagine your city, how often you go across town. Sometimes you might never, but many people, okay, my grandma lives there, or I have friends there, or I go over for work or to eat. It's very similar here, but you're crossing an international boundary, and there's big economic implications related to that at a local level. I would just go back to the second thing I would say, Mark, is just in relation to your original question about I guess the funds that people are paying to come being put into a system. It's interesting because just a few weeks ago, maybe a couple months ago, we hosted a couple of FBI agents who shared with a group. They work in counterterrorism and anti-human trafficking. And at the end of the presentation, that was something that they put forward. And for them, it was more like, how do we take control away from organized crime, from the cartels? And if we have these legal systems that people can come through, not only could it benefit U.S. economically, but it's also going to take away a lot of power from the cartels and the organized crime that are also destabilizing the countries and creating some of those pushback factors in the first place. Thanks, Mark.
I love that. Yeah, the crisis is so complex there, and yet this is a hopeful discussion because I think it just shows that we haven't fully fleshed out all of the economic reform possibilities that could work towards repair and dignity and human flourishing. So that's exciting. I want to switch over now into Spanish and hear from a pastor, a sister, a partner there at the border in Tijuana who's going to share a little bit of her story. Pastora Adriana Reyes Galindo from Tijuana is here with us. Saludos, Pastora. We're so glad to have you. We're going to switch over and hear a testimony from her now. So if you need translation into English, you can go to the button below that says interpretation and select the other language to hear this call in your language. So thanks for your patience and grace as we switch over into Spanish now. En este momento estoy encantado presentar a Pastora Adriana Reyes Galindo de Tijuana. Y para empezar, les voy a contar un poco de ella. Ella viene de la Ciudad de México y estudió para licencia en educación primaria, pero tras de visitar la ciudad de Tijuana, donde ella vive ahora, ella vino a apoyar en una iglesia allá que atendía a niños y niñas que no tenían lugar en una escuela. Y al final ella quedó ahí 8 años. Y fue ahí donde ella se casó con su esposo, José Antonio Altamirano, y comenzaron una nueva vida y nuevo ministerio, Iglesia Camino de Salvación en la ciudad de Tijuana, y ellos tienen 3 hijas. Y ahora en 2016 decidieron abrir las puertas de la Iglesia Camino de Salvación como un albergue, migrant shelter, para personas migrantes y han recibido más de 5,000 huéspedes, ¿verdad, pastora? Entonces, en hoy día ella es pastora de la Iglesia Bautista Camino de Salvación en Tijuana y también es una inspectora de educación primaria allí en Tijuana. Pastora, gracias por estar aquí con nosotros. Dinos, por favor, ¿cuál, desde donde está usted, es la situación para migrantes que están allí en el otro lado de la frontera, esperando en México, buscando asilo, huyendo de pobreza o violencia? Danos un vistazo de tu historia y cuéntanos, por favor, lo que ves ahí en lo diario, pastora.
Sí, buenos días, Dios les bendiga. Un gusto estar con ustedes. Y la verdad es que escuchándolos ustedes me estoy impactada de todo lo que vive también Estados Unidos acerca de la migración. Pero nosotros estamos en esa puerta, o más bien en el medio de recibir a todos estos migrantes, a todos estos huéspedes, queremos decirles nosotros, atendiendo a lo que dice la palabra de que debemos de ser hospitalarios. Debemos apoyar a la gente que lo necesita con ese techo, con esa comida para su diario vivir, pero para poder seguir en su tránsito. Sé que es difícil ahorita cómo llegan las personas y máxime que ahorita todos los recursos migratorios están cerrados. Tenemos personas que ya tienen 6, 7, 8 meses intentando tener una cita para poder cruzar legalmente a Estados Unidos. Sin embargo, pues esto no se ha dado empieza la desesperación, empieza la frustración, el desánimo, y entonces empiezan a entregarse, como ellos dicen, empiezan a aventarse. Y las últimas noticias que he recibido o que hemos visto también por televisión es que al cruzar el muro, varias han fracturado piernas, cadera, porque es una difícil, su desesperación los lleva a hacer todo esto. Nosotros como iglesia que decidimos abrir en 2016, primeramente con la caravana de los haitianos, pues estando mi esposo, veíamos la aglomeración en el centro de la ciudad, donde dormían literalmente en la calle, mujeres, niños, varones, pero pues obviamente el corazón se nos aprieta, ¿verdad? Se nos estruja cuando vemos a los niños y pues las mujeres, bebés. Y mi esposo dijo, bueno, nosotros como iglesia tenemos este lugar donde nada más abrimos domingos y miércoles y alguna actividad. Y hay un techo. ¿Cómo se puede desperdiciar un lugar para que no esté viviendo y la gente esté en la calle? Entonces decidimos abrir, empezando que no sabíamos a lo que nos metíamos realmente. Es lo que siempre les digo, no imaginábamos la magnitud de lo que nos estábamos metiendo, ya que los hermanos se emocionan y dicen, sí, vamos a ayudar. Sin tener cama, sin tener cocina, sin tener absolutamente algo para darles a nuestros migrantes. 2 cobijas, una cartera de huevo, aceite para poder iniciar. Pero la bendición o la bondad de Dios es tan grande que dijo, voy a multiplicar esta parte para que puedan tener a estos huéspedes, a estas personas. Iniciamos con 30 personas y pues de allí pues dijimos vamos a seguir y Dios fue proveyendo las necesidades para camas, para cocina, baños, regaderas, toda esta parte para que se sientan cómodos. ¿Y por qué le llamamos huésped? Ya lo vuelvo a repetir, por la hospitalidad para tener. Y algo que nos impactó a nosotros muchos, estamos certeros como iglesia, tenemos que cumplir una visión y la misión. Hechos 1:8 nos dice que empezaremos por Jerusalén, Judea, Samaria y hasta el último de la tierra. Pero a veces las posibilidades económicas, decimos en la iglesia mexicana o hispana, no hay recursos, pero vimos la bendición de Dios de que Él los está trayendo. Nos está trayendo a las naciones para darles esa palabra de esperanza y que puedan vivir esa paz que sobrepasa todo entendimiento. Darles esa oportunidad en esa desesperación, frustración, en esas salidas que están haciendo de su país de origen, poder atenderles de una manera correcta. Y algo que me llena, como ya los escuché a ustedes, es que realmente a veces nosotros queremos ser de bendición, pero nuestros migrantes, nuestros huéspedes, son de bendición para nosotros, porque están en primeramente, cuando tuvimos los haitianos, todos los días teníamos hora de iglesia, así le llamamos. Estar orando y fortaleciendo. Entonces, son los que nos sostienen para seguir en los ministerios y en las diferentes tareas que tenemos que atender, cumpliendo la visión y la misión de nuestro Dios. Y la verdad es que me siento agradecida porque no nos hemos quedado solos. Aún con pandemia, el albergue no se pudo cerrar. Atendimos, tuvimos cuarentena y seguimos adelante. Desafortunadamente, en esta pandemia, mi esposo partió, fue afectado por el COVID, pero sus últimas palabras me dijo, cuida al albergue. Y es lo que estamos haciendo. Y no nada más porque me lo haya dicho, fueron las palabras de Dios, de decir, tenemos que tener cuidado de las personas. Y sobre todo, si son niñas, mujeres y aún los varones, porque somos humanos. Somos personas que por las circunstancias adversas de cada lugar tenemos que emigrar o tenemos que salir para dar oportunidad a nuestras nuevas generaciones de una vida mejor.
Gracias, pastora. Estamos muy agradecidos por su obra y por tomar el tiempo de compartir con nosotros. Y pues como nuestra amiga Anne en el chat nos ha preguntado, ahora como terminamos, yo tengo una pregunta final para todos ustedes 5. Y quiero empezar con usted, pastora, pensando en todo lo que pasa en este sistema, ¿qué podemos hacer? ¿Cuál es la recomendación que usted tiene para pastores, líderes de las iglesias en los Estados Unidos o cualquiera personas que tienen influencia en sus comunidades espirituales aquí? ¿Cuál es el consejo más importante de acción que usted diría, por favor, haga esto?
Pues primeramente es orar, seguir intercediendo unos por otros y por estas necesidades que nos podamos abrir. Y indudablemente podemos dar el alimento, podemos dar el abrigo, podemos dar ropa, pero algo que también nuestros huéspedes necesitan es ser escuchados. Que ellos cuenten su historia y que como iglesia de todo el mundo tenemos que aprender a escuchar. Tenemos que no nada más cubrir las necesidades físicas, sino las emocionales, las espirituales. Somos seres integrales que necesitamos fortalecer y estar en esa comunión en todos los aspectos. Y algo que yo les pido a las iglesias, ¿verdad? Es que en esa necesidad de que necesitamos que nuestros huéspedes no nada más cubran la labor del trabajo, sino darles la oportunidad de estudiar, de poder ayudarles a que tengan esa herramienta para seguir hacia adelante. Porque cuando es migrante, las posibilidades de estudio se van cerrando. Como maestra, siempre estoy interesada de que niño que llegue a la iglesia pueda entrar a la escuela. Difícilmente a veces se puede hacer, pero lo podemos lograr. Abrir bibliotecas en nuestras iglesias para que si no puedan estar en la escuela, por lo menos puedan un maestro de la iglesia como voluntario o voluntaria estar enseñándolo, ya sea el nuevo idioma, en el caso de Estados Unidos, el inglés, o estarles enseñando las habilidades básicas para desarrollar una carrera básica o algo así. Entonces, hay tanto trabajo que hay que hacer, ¿verdad? Pero algo así específico para mí es la educación para que sigan adelante como herramienta. Gracias.
Gracias. Oración, educación, prayer and education, mentoring. Can we give a round of applause of appreciation, a virtual round of applause, un aplauso virtual para Pastora Adriana? Gracias, hermana, por todo tu trabajo y por venir a compartir con nosotros hoy. Liliana, también quiero preguntarle lo mismo. ¿Cuál es el consejo más importante que dejaría con nosotros?
Sí, gracias, Mark, por tu pregunta. Yo creo que las cosas, o sea, yo creo que las dos cosas más importantes es no tener miedo de comenzar donde estamos. So one of the first things I want to encourage people is like not to be afraid to start where you're at. So whether that's learning, reading a book, through a book club, through your small group, through your discipleship group, start where you're at. Así que si usted tiene un grupo pequeño o tiene un grupo de escuela dominical, puede comenzar ahí. Agarren un libro juntos, junto con su Biblia, y comiencen juntos a aprender y a escuchar y así comenzar esa jornada. And then the other thing that I would encourage is to continue to remember that, we can invite others into that journey and that we are the church. And so what that means is that, we want to find other places. If our church is not ready to respond, then me and my friends can go and do something and find something and someone to walk alongside with in solidarity to continue that learning. Así que si mi iglesia no está lista para hacer comenzar esa jornada de aprender más de inmigración, cómo podemos responder a las necesidades en la frontera, entonces yo, mis amigas, mi comunidad que ya están listos para hacer el primer paso, podemos encontrar otras iglesias, o no encontrar otras iglesias, sino encontrar otras organizaciones en las cuales podemos venir al lado con ellas y así poder hacer ese vínculo, ¿no? Para poder responder a lo que está pasando y comenzar ahí. Así que no tengamos miedo de comenzar. So I think the best thing to do is not to be afraid to start wherever you're at.
Me encanta eso. Empieza pequeño aunque sea, ¿no? Start small and have courage. I love that. Gracias, Liliana. Matthew, ¿cuál es el consejo principal que
Pues
usted diría? Por favor, hagan esto. Una cosa.
Pues lo único que agregaría sería que tenemos que pensar en la parte de la política pública también, porque para mí a raíz de muchos de estos desafíos son un sistema de inmigración de los Estados Unidos que no sirve bien ni para los estadounidenses, ni para los migrantes, ni para la seguridad de nuestro país, ni para nuestra economía. So, I think in addition to everything Liliana and Pastor Adriana have said, we also need to focus in on the systemic policy challenges with our immigration system that honestly is not serving American citizens very well. It's not serving our security well. It's not serving migrants very well. It's not serving our economy very well. And we have, that's where the role of advocacy can be really important for those of us who are followers of Jesus.
Amén. Gracias, Matthew. Pastor Paco, una cosita más.
Yo nada más nos recordaría, somos la iglesia de Cristo. Nuestro Señor Jesús es el mejor modelo y su gracia que nos ha alcanzado, ha creado espacio para nosotros. Nos animaría si no somos diferentes a todos los demás. Entonces, en realidad, ¿qué somos? Creo que somos la iglesia de Cristo para vivir radicalmente en este mundo. Tenemos solamente una oportunidad, una vida para vivir aquí. Entonces, yo diría amar a los más que podamos en las maneras que más podamos. Yo le animo a la iglesia. No tenemos nada que temer, todo para ganar.
Amén, Pastor. Gracias que el Espíritu Santo nos da ese poder para amar. May the Spirit give us the power to love, like you were saying. I love that. Thank you so much. En este momento vamos a regresar a inglés para terminar. Entonces, si usted habla español, puedes hacer clic en el botón que dice interpretación abajo y selecciona español una vez más para terminar escuchando la llamada en tu idioma. Okay, so at this time, we're going to switch back over into English to wrap up. So you can click on the button below that says interpretation to find the call in your language. And so thank you, leaders, for starting to share some of these action steps, things that you would say. What would you do? If you could leave us with one final call to action, please do this. And Sammy, I'd like to ask you as well to speak into that. What would you leave us with? What should pastors and church leaders and those who have influence in their communities do? What one thing would you say? Go and do this.
I'll just add one more thing. I think, and sort of back to something I mentioned before, but it's so incredibly important how we speak about other people. Our words are very important. When we're speaking about others, whoever it is, we're speaking about precious human beings made in the image of God. And we should speak with the utmost respect and care, trying to avoid dehumanization, polarization, and again, just avoid at all costs bearing false witness against our neighbors. That made it into the 10 Commandments in line with thou shalt not murder or have adultery. It's at that level, and yet our words, it seemed like they've become cheap, and they've become cheap sometimes in our churches too. So thank you.
That's a good word. Thank you, Sammy. And as we close, I just want to invite anyone who's here, whether you're listening to the recording or you're here live, you've hung in with us a few extra minutes. In closing, we are starting at World Relief a national movement of churches who are doing just what you all have said, who are leaning into this work. It's called Churches of Welcome, churches of all different backgrounds and histories that are embarking on this journey together to engage one of the greatest humanitarian crises of our time in the work of immigration and refugee resettlement. And we think that this is, like so many have alluded to, an opportunity to participate in our own healing and renewal of the church in the U.S. for the future. And so we're building a community of churches that want to welcome well. If you're interested in doing that, we're putting together a prayer and launch team for that. I would like to send you and follow up an invitation to join that. Churches of Welcome. And also tapping into what Matthew said, if you're moved by the complexity and challenges of what's happening at the border, then I invite you to speak the truth in love to your elected officials. Ask them to take sensible, compassionate action toward reform, one that respects the rule of law and security, but also honors the image of God in all people, whether that's asylum seekers or overwhelmed Border Patrol agents. Right. And this might sound scary, but I want to put this out to you. What voices will be shaping our nation's leaders if those of us who love the way of Jesus stay silent? And I bet you can imagine the Christian voices that they do hear and perhaps the spiritual nuance that might be lacking. In fact, I called my senator's office this month, Senator Marsha Blackburn in Tennessee. And surprisingly, the representative I spoke to in her office said, I've never had an evangelical Christian call in and say these kinds of things to me. Can I get what you just said in writing? Will you email that over to me? And so I was kind of ready to go to war. And yet there was a posture of listening. So you might be surprised. And I would say, pragmatically, this is your tax base, your tax revenue that's paying for this work. You have the right to ask our leaders to steward it towards sensible biblical compassion. Again, the majority of them might think they know what that means from a Christian perspective, but they can't grow in this area unless we as the church speak into it. So I want to follow up with you on some simple resources. We've made it easy to do that, to reach out to your elected officials. And if you think that your church or students or a group of faith leaders are ready to learn more about what's going on at the border, Abara, Sammy Di Pasquale's organization, leads border encounters for people of all types to help rehumanize the relationships that are involved in this situation outside of what we hear in the news cycles. Invitations to listen and learn and reflect on what the border can teach us and who we're meant to become and how we can engage closer to home, even if we're not in a border town or city. So I'm going to send that out to you as well and follow up for that opportunity. And one last thing, if you're ready, if your church is ready to go even deeper, we want to invite you to form a good neighbor team with World Relief. This can be you and your small group or a group of friends that can form a team of 6, 10 people who can help to resettle a family in your community. Whether you're near one of our offices or even states away, we can now coach and walk alongside of you as you help a family to orient and stabilize and adjust a new life in the United States. I would love to tell you more about that. So please consider, maybe your church is ready to receive the blessing of mutual friendship and welcome. Maybe you're thinking this year, we're not going to take a missions trip. Instead, we are going to do this without even leaving our county, right? Doing this work of welcome here in our community. I'd love to tell you more about that. So now I just want to send you off with a blessing. If you would lift your hands with me. And I just want to thank the Lord for this time that we've had together and say to you, may the Lord bless you with truth and love, peace and wisdom in the Holy Spirit as you step into this tough and beautiful work of welcome. In the name of Jesus Christ, go in peace. And thank you all for being here.